During her Senate confirmation hearings, Amy Coney Barrett faced an intense and often contentious atmosphere marked by sharp questioning and deep ideological divides. The hearings took place under extraordinary circumstances. A vacant Supreme Court seat had opened just weeks before a major presidential election, and the decision to swiftly confirm a nominee ignited significant controversy. The process was inherently political, yet the focus on Barrett's judicial philosophy and potential influence on landmark rulings took center stage. One of the most debated aspects of Barrett's nomination was her adherence to a judicial philosophy known as originalism. This approach involves interpreting the Constitution based on the meaning it had at the time it was written. Advocates of originalism argue that it ensures consistency and limits judicial overreach, while critics claim it can lead to outdated or regressive decisions that fail to address contemporary societal issues. During the hearings, Barrett was repeatedly asked to clarify how her originalist views would affect her rulings on cases involving issues such as reproductive rights, healthcare, and civil liberties. Her responses, while measured, did little to allay the concerns of those who feared a significant ideological shift in the court's balance. The senators pressed Barrett on specific precedents, including landmark decisions like Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, both of which protect abortion rights. Although she stopped short of indicating how she would rule on such cases, she acknowledged that while these decisions are considered precedents of the court, not all precedents are immune from being overturned. This nuanced stance alarmed many who viewed her confirmation as a potential threat to long-standing constitutional protections. In their questioning, several senators highlighted how the implications of her potential rulings could affect millions of Americans, especially marginalized communities who depend on the court's protection for their civil rights. Healthcare was another critical issue during the hearings. Barrett was questioned about her views on the Affordable Care Act, particularly in light of her past writings that criticized decisions upholding the law. The timing was especially significant, as the court was scheduled to hear a case that could potentially dismantle the ACA shortly after the election. While Barrett did not explicitly commit to a position on the upcoming case, senators expressed concern that her presence on the bench could tip the scales against the ACA, leading to the loss of health coverage for millions. Her insistence on impartiality and her claim that she had no agenda were met with skepticism, especially given her previously published critiques and her judicial record. The process also brought into sharp relief the contrasting approaches to constitutional interpretation and the broader philosophical divide between judicial restraint and judicial activism. Barrett's assertion that judges should not legislate from the bench aligned with a conservative legal perspective that prioritizes limiting the judiciary's role. However, her critics argued that such restraint, in practice, often leads to rulings that favor entrenched power structures and roll back progressive gains. The hearings thus became a proxy for a much larger cultural and political conflict about the future of the judiciary and its role in shaping public life. Throughout the proceedings, Barrett's demeanor was composed and methodical, and she often deferred to judicial norms to avoid taking definitive positions on controversial subjects. This approach frustrated some senators, who felt that her non-committal answers concealed significant ideological leanings. Others viewed her careful responses as a sign of judicial discipline and respect for the boundaries of the confirmation process. Regardless of interpretation, her performance at the hearings underscored the careful balancing act nominees must perform, projecting both independence and alignment with the legal principles valued by the appointing administration. In the broader context, Barrett's confirmation hearings highlighted how judicial nominations have become battlegrounds for competing visions of constitutional interpretation. The intense scrutiny she faced was not only about her personal qualifications or legal intellect, both of which were acknowledged by many on both sides of the aisle, but about the long-term impact of her potential decisions. The stakes were particularly high given the lifetime nature of a Supreme Court appointment and the likelihood that she would serve on the bench for decades, influencing rulings on everything from voting rights to environmental regulations. These hearings served as a vivid reminder that the Supreme Court, while ostensibly insulated from politics, remains deeply enmeshed in the nation's ideological struggles. The questions directed at Barrett were as much about the legitimacy and future direction of the court as they were about her individual views. The courtroom decorum of the hearings only partly masked the intensity of the political and legal debates at their heart. During her confirmation hearings, Amy Coney Barrett was repeatedly questioned about whether she would recuse herself from any cases involving the 2020 presidential election. This issue was raised due to the highly charged political environment in which her nomination occurred, as well as concerns about the impartiality of the judiciary. With the election imminent and legal challenges already anticipated, the possibility that the Supreme Court might be called upon to decide election-related disputes made this line of questioning especially urgent. Senators wanted assurances that she would step aside from any case in which her presence might raise doubts about the fairness or independence of the court's decision. Barrett, however, declined to make any firm commitments on recusal. She consistently responded that such decisions must follow legal and ethical guidelines established by judicial norms. Her position was that recusal is a legal question, not a political one, and must be evaluated based on the specific circumstances of each case. She emphasized that, if confirmed, she would carefully consult the applicable statutes and judicial precedents, consider the views of her colleagues on the court, and act in accordance with the requirements of impartial justice. While this answer was legally sound and consistent with judicial practice, it left many senators and observers dissatisfied. The concern was not just hypothetical. The nomination had come very close to an election in which legal disputes were already unfolding, and Barrett's appointment would create a clear ideological shift in the court's composition. Critics worried that even the appearance of partiality could undermine public confidence in the court's ability to remain neutral in such a politically fraught moment. In this context, her refusal to commit to recusal, however grounded in judicial norms, was seen by some as evasive. These concerns were amplified by the speed and timing of the confirmation process. The nomination advanced through the Senate with extraordinary urgency, bypassing traditional norms of deliberation and consultation. Critics argued that such haste inherently politicized the court, placing any new justice under suspicion of being part of a partisan effort. Barrett, during the hearings, attempted to counter this perception by underscoring her independence. She asserted that she had not made any promises or commitments about how she would rule on specific cases. Still, the optics of the situation were difficult to overcome. Senators asked pointed questions about how the public could be expected to trust the court's decisions if justices were perceived as politically aligned. Barrett responded by emphasizing that judges must be guided by the law and not by the identity of the parties before them. She noted that her record demonstrated an ability to rule fairly regardless of political implications. Nonetheless, the fact remained that the Supreme Court has no formal mechanism to enforce recusal, leaving it to each justice's discretion. This heightened anxiety about the potential for conflicts of interest, especially in high-stakes cases. Barrett's reliance on precedent and procedure in her responses reflected a broader view of the judiciary as an institution bound by rules, rather than by public opinion or political expediency. She explained that committing to a recusal in advance of a case could imply prejudgment, which would violate judicial ethics. Moreover, she argued that such commitments could set a dangerous precedent, turning confirmation hearings into venues where nominees are pressured to make promises they ethically cannot uphold. From her perspective, neutrality is maintained by adhering to a process rather than by offering assurances. Still, for many senators and members of the public, process alone was not enough. The stakes of the moment demanded clear signals that the integrity of the election would not be compromised by the involvement of a newly confirmed justice. Legal nuance aside, the question was as much about perception and trust as it was about doctrine. The court's legitimacy depends not only on its rulings, but also on the public's belief that those rulings are made without bias or undue influence. Barrett's performance during these exchanges revealed the tension between judicial ethics and public accountability. On the one hand, she maintained a principled refusal to discuss specific cases or commit to future actions, a stance rooted in a long tradition of judicial restraint. On the other hand, her unwillingness to offer even general reassurance on such a sensitive topic left a vacuum that critics quickly filled with suspicion and doubt. The ambiguity of her answers, while legally defensible, may have inadvertently deepened the perception that the court was becoming increasingly entangled in the nation's partisan conflicts. The hearings illustrated how even abstract questions of ethics and procedure can become intensely political when they intersect with real-world power struggles. The issue of recusal, in this case, became a symbol of the broader debate over the independence and integrity of the judiciary. It was not just about one justice, but about the credibility of the court itself. During the confirmation hearings, Amy Coney Barrett consistently avoided taking definitive positions on specific legal cases or controversial issues. This strategy was deeply rooted in a tradition often referred to as the Ginsburg Rule, a principle that judicial nominees should refrain from offering previews or hints about how they might rule in future cases. Barrett cited this principle repeatedly as she responded to questions about a wide range of subjects, from reproductive rights and healthcare to environmental regulation and civil liberties. Her refusal to engage in hypotheticals or express personal opinions was portrayed as a sign of judicial discipline and a commitment to impartiality. Many senators, however, were frustrated by what they saw as overly cautious responses. They pressed her on landmark decisions such as Roe v. Wade, Obergefell v. Hodges, and Brown v. Board of Education, asking whether she believed these cases had been correctly decided or whether she viewed them as settled law. Barrett declined to offer direct opinions on most of these decisions. In some instances, she acknowledged the precedent status of certain rulings, but she stopped short of affirming that those decisions were beyond reconsideration. This restraint was interpreted by some as a deliberate effort to obscure her true views, especially given her previous academic writings and affiliations that suggested conservative leanings. The hearings made clear that Barrett's approach was to maintain a strict boundary between her role as a nominee and the responsibilities she would hold as a sitting justice. She emphasized that making any statement about the correctness of past decisions could be perceived as bias if a related case were to come before the court in the future. She also noted that the Supreme Court does not treat all precedents equally, distinguishing between those considered super precedents and others that, while established, may still be open to challenge. This distinction added to the concerns of those who feared that foundational legal protections could be revisited or even overturned. Barrett's reliance on precedent as a concept was central to her judicial philosophy, but she also made it clear that not all precedents are permanent. She explained that there is a structured process through which the court evaluates whether a previous decision should stand. Factors such as the quality of the legal reasoning, consistency with related rulings, and developments in law or society all contribute to whether a precedent is upheld or overturned. Critics argued that her nuanced view left room for significant shifts in the law under her influence, even if she refused to acknowledge any such intention. Throughout the hearings, she was questioned repeatedly on whether she would uphold the Affordable Care Act, particularly in light of an upcoming case, challenging the law's constitutionality. Barrett avoided answering directly, noting that it would be inappropriate to comment on a pending case. She emphasized that she had no agenda and that her previous academic writings should not be seen as indicators of how she would rule. While this position was consistent with the ethical constraints of the judicial confirmation process, it did little to quell fears that her appointment could jeopardize access to health care for millions of Americans. When asked about voting rights, gun control, and climate change, Barrett again declined to offer specific viewpoints. Instead, she framed each issue in terms of legal principles and judicial methodology. Her responses often emphasized the importance of adhering to the text of statutes and the Constitution, as well as respecting the boundaries of judicial power. For supporters, this reflected a commendable restraint and fidelity to the rule of law. For detractors, it came across as evasive and unresponsive to the urgent real-world implications of her potential decisions. Barrett's avoidance of specific stances underscored a broader debate about the role of judges in a democracy. Some senators argued that the public has a right to understand how a nominee's values and interpretive methods might influence their rulings, especially on issues with widespread social impact. Others contended that demanding such disclosures risks politicizing the judiciary and undermining the appearance of neutrality. Barrett, for her part, remained firm in her belief that impartiality requires a judge to come to each case with an open mind, guided solely by the law and the facts. The The result of this careful balancing act was a hearing characterized by meticulous legal discussion but few clear answers. Barrett's performance left observers divided. While many acknowledged her intellectual rigor and adherence to judicial ethics, others worried that her reluctance to engage more openly suggested a hidden agenda or a lack of transparency. Her refusal to commit to specific legal positions, while consistent with long-standing norms of judicial conduct, also highlighted the limitations of the confirmation process in providing clarity about how a nominee will shape the future of constitutional law. Throughout the confirmation hearings, Amy Coney Barrett addressed growing concerns about the perception of the Supreme Court as a politically influenced institution. In recent years, the public discourse surrounding the court has increasingly reflected a belief that its decisions are not only legal in nature, but also driven by ideological affiliations. This view has emerged in part due to high-profile rulings that have aligned closely with political interests, as well as the timing and manner of judicial appointments. Barrett was acutely aware of these tensions and made deliberate efforts to reinforce the idea that the judiciary operates independently of partisan pressure. One of the central messages she delivered during the hearings was that justices are not political agents, nor are they beholden to the parties or presidents who appoint them. She stated unequivocally that her role as a judge is to interpret the law as written, applying constitutional and statutory principles without regard to political consequences. In doing so, she emphasized the difference between a judge's personal beliefs and their judicial obligations. This distinction was vital to her defense against allegations that her confirmation was part of a broader effort to influence legal outcomes on contentious national issues. Barrett repeatedly invoked the principle of judicial impartiality, insisting that her decisions would be guided solely by the facts of the case and the applicable law. She framed the role of a Supreme Court justice as one that requires a disciplined, methodical approach, one that avoids injecting personal preferences into legal analysis. This vision of judicial responsibility aligns with her broader commitment to textualism and originalism, which prioritize the literal meaning of legal texts and the intentions of the drafters at the time they were written. According to her, such an approach acts as a safeguard against arbitrary or politically motivated rulings. Despite these assurances, skepticism persisted among some senators and members of the public. They pointed to the broader context of her nomination and confirmation process, which unfolded under highly politicized conditions. For these critics, her presence on the court symbolized a shift in judicial power that could tilt the balance on critical issues like reproductive rights, healthcare, and voting access. Barrett's defense of the court's independence was seen by some as an idealized view, out of step with the reality of how judicial decisions are often perceived by the public. She acknowledged that perception matters and that public confidence in the judiciary is essential, but she maintained that the solution lies in consistent, principled judging rather than public relations efforts. In an effort to bridge the gap between the public's concerns and her vision of judicial restraint, Barrett spoke about the importance of judicial humility. She described the job of a justice as one that requires listening more than speaking, exercising caution rather than ambition, and showing respect for precedent while remaining open to reassessing flawed rulings. This view cast the court not as an engine of social change, but as a stabilizing institution tasked with interpreting the law, not creating it. Her commitment to this philosophy was evident in her careful, sometimes guarded responses to questions throughout the hearings. At the same time, she acknowledged the complexity of the court's role in a democratic society. The decisions made by the justices have far-reaching consequences and can directly impact people's lives. While she avoided commenting on specific future cases, she recognized that the public watches the court closely and often interprets its actions through a political lens. Her message was that the best way to restore trust is not through rhetoric, but through consistent, principled jurisprudence over time. By adhering to a disciplined methodology, she argued, justices can demonstrate that they are not influenced by the politics of the moment. Her remarks about the court's legitimacy came at a time when calls to reform the judiciary, including proposals to expand the number of justices or impose term limits, were gaining traction. She did not engage directly with these debates, instead focusing on her belief that the court's strength lies in its separation from the political branches of government. She emphasized that the judiciary is not designed to respond to public opinion or political pressures, but to interpret the law as it stands. This vision of the court places a heavy burden on public faith in judicial integrity. Barrett's attempt to affirm the court's neutrality was not just a defense of her own nomination, but a broader argument for how the judiciary should be viewed and trusted. The hearings, while tense and politically charged, provided her with a platform to articulate her philosophy of judging, a philosophy grounded in independence, restraint, and a deep respect for legal tradition. Whether that vision can withstand the growing pressures of partisanship remains an open question, but it was central to how she presented herself during the confirmation process. As the confirmation hearings came to a close, the proceedings surrounding Amy Coney Barrett's nomination offered a revealing snapshot of the tensions currently defining the American judicial and political landscape. Her performance throughout the process was marked by a steady adherence to judicial restraint, a disciplined refusal to speculate on future rulings, and a firm insistence on the independence of the Supreme Court. While these attributes aligned with long-standing traditions of the judiciary, they also underscored the limits of what such hearings can achieve in an era of deep partisan mistrust. Barrett presented herself as a judge committed to the Constitution, to textual fidelity, and to the principle that personal beliefs should play no role in the application of the law. Her repeated assertions that she had no political agenda and that she would remain faithful to her judicial methodology were designed to reassure a skeptical public that the court remains above the political fray. However, for many observers, these declarations did not resolve the concerns surrounding the timing and manner of her confirmation. The broader context in which her nomination was fast-tracked in the midst of a heated election cycle cast a long shadow over her assurances of impartiality. The hearings became more than just a review of one nominee's record. They served as a forum for a national conversation about the future of the judiciary. Senators used the occasion to articulate contrasting visions of the court's role in American life. Some portrayed the court as a guardian of hard-won rights and protections, others as a neutral arbiter whose legitimacy depends on resisting political influence. Barrett stood at the center of these debates, offering a portrait of a judge committed to restraint, even as questions swirled about how her confirmation could reshape the ideological balance of the court for generations. For supporters, her calm demeanor, legal acumen, and personal story were testaments to her qualifications and readiness for the role. They viewed her responses as evidence of a disciplined legal mind, focused not on policy outcomes but on constitutional principles. For critics, however, the refusal to take positions on critical issues, combined with concerns about her past, writings, and affiliations, left them unconvinced that her decisions would be free of ideological influence. Ultimately, the hearings did not resolve the broader debate over the court's politicization. Instead, they illuminated how judicial confirmations have evolved into ideological battlegrounds, contests not only over individuals, but over visions of law, governance, and power. Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation marked another chapter in this ongoing transformation, one that leaves the court more scrutinized, more politicized, and more consequential than ever. How she chooses to wield that influence, and whether she can live up to the ideals of independence and neutrality she so strongly defended, will be measured not in words but in the decisions she renders